Cutdown day has come and gone, and we know the initial 53-man rosters for every team. So, what have we learnt this preseason, and how will it impact those all-important fantasy football drafts? Everything you need to know on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Today I'm going to take you through everything you should have learned from Cutdown Day and the preseason. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and all of my rankings can be found at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and my articles are at football.rasball.com. Let's get straight into it because this could be a long video if I talk for too long. So this is how it's going to work. I'm basically going to show you every depth chart as we know it now, having seen the preseason and the cutdowns, and just taking you through the big news from every team across the NFL. Going through them all pretty quickly. If you've got any questions, of course, hit us up on Instagram or Twitter, or of course, you can leave a question in the comments as well. Starting off with the Arizona Cardinals, because we're going in alphabetical order. And for the Cardinals, the running back room was very interesting. It's become very clear that James Conner is the lead runner. Trey Benson's upside is clearly limited because they were very clear in the offseason that Amari DeMarcado or Michael Carter, who got released, is going to be the third down back. And if James Conner goes down, there is no doubt that Benson will be involved on early downs, but I do think that DeMarcado takes that third down role. That makes Benson one of the less positive, or at least the less upside handcuffs that you can get across the league. And he's not someone I'm really going out of my way to get. On the wide receiver room, Zay Jones got suspended, and that means Greg Dortch is the definite starter, at least for the first 5 to 6 weeks. What happens when Jones comes back? Well, we don't really know, but if Dortch plays well in that time, he could well have locked in that starting role. We have seen him had some good games in the past, but I don't know that he's going to be able to bring it across. Now that they've got Marvin Harrison Jr. there, I think he's going to take a lot of the snaps. Plus, they've got Trey McBride as well. So I think that Dortch isn't someone you need to go out of your way to get. Tip Ryman did make the roster, but he's very much a blocking back. He's no threat to Trey McBride at all. Atlanta Falcons. Jason McClellan has beaten out Carlos Washington for the running back 3 spot, but realistically, you don't need either of them. This is going to be all Bijan Robinson. Tyler Algier is one of the more valuable handcuffs you can get. My only concern is that Avery Williams was used quite a bit at times last year as a 2-minute drill guy, and that could continue this season. That will affect Robinson a little bit. We didn't really see him much in the preseason because he was injured for the most part. Ray-Ray McCloud is very clearly the slot receiver, I guess you'd say, but certainly the guy is going to be there on 11 personnel. And we're going to see a lot of 11 personnel because we're going to see essentially the Rams system this year. Rondale Moore's injured, so there's no threat to McLeod at all. There's really no one else on their roster. It's not going to be Hodge. He's not going to move to the slot. It's not going to be Washington. Neither of those guys are really true threats. So McLeod suddenly becomes a fantasy option, especially in PPR. And Kyle Pitts, I mean, there's no receiving threats there. We haven't seen Charlie Warner or Ross Dwelly really do any good receiving work for years with the 49ers, even when George Kittle went down. So Kyle Pitts is the clear receiving guy here. Baltimore Ravens, and there's a whole lot of question marks. We don't know what's happening with Kid Mitchell. He has been put on IR, but he is designated for return. That's what DFR means there. Guys that just say IR next to them, they're out for the season. Guys that just say INJ, they're injured, but they're not on any sort of IR or PUP list. That means that Kid Mitchell should be back at some stage, and we don't really know what his role is going to look like. I suspect he's a change of pace option compared to Derrick Henry. That means Henry's value could drop as the season goes on. So I wouldn't be going out of my way to try to sell Henry now. I'd be just letting him have a couple of good weeks because I think he will have a couple of good weeks. And then you probably want to sell him when we start hearing about Keaton Mitchell potentially coming back. Justice Hill will likely be the third down back, but we have seen Henry do more receiving work recently. And realistically, in Baltimore, the receiving back isn't really that valuable anyway. The receiving rooms is very, very, very ugly. Zay Flowers, a little bit of Rashad Bateman. Nelson Aguilar will be out there, but I expect to see a lot of 12 personnel. And then the backups, they seem to be doing it by position, which is what some teams do in the preseason. How that affects what happens during the season, we'll have to wait and see. Keith Kirk was actually the first one pulled, but Tylan Wallace should be the guy that's up there. And Devontae Walker, well, he's a 4th-round pick, and we expected him to be a little bit high, but he was well down the depth chart for most of the preseason. I do think that he eventually jumps possibly up to that number 4 role and could threaten the starting lineup, but I don't know. He's not someone I'm going out of my way to get in redraft leagues. I do think he still has some value in Dynasty. Buffalo Bills, nothing really particularly surprising here. I guess the most positive news is that James Cook was used as a very definitive RB1. They used him for a long period of time. They didn't cycle him out with Ray Davis, who was the clear number 2. And they didn't get Ty Johnson involved, even though he might be involved on some 3rd and longs. I think this makes James Cook the clear starter and a very valuable starter, and it makes Ray Davis the clear backup and a very valuable backup as well. I do think that these two guys are both going to have good seasons if things work for them. For James Cook, he just needs to stay healthy and play well and not fumble the ball. For Ray Davis, he just needs a James Cook injury, and suddenly he's a possible league winner because we know they're still going to want to run the ball. Now, to be fair, some teams do just have players play for chunks in the preseason and then cycle them more during the actual season. That is possible, but I do think personally that James Cook is going to provide quite a lot of value for people that take him at his current value in drafts. Keon Coleman and Mac Hollins look like they're going to be dominating the 2 wide receiver sets. That's what happened in the preseason. Coleman is essentially locked into that wide receiver 1 role. That doesn't mean he's going to get the most targets, but he's certainly going to be out there the most. But Mac Hollins being there on the outside when we thought maybe Khalil Shakir could do it with Curtis Samuel in the slot, it's a little bit of a surprise. Admittedly, Curtis Samuel has been injured, but he wasn't in week 1 of the preseason, and we saw he and Shakir cycle a little bit. So it is a little bit concerning, especially because Mac Hollins was injured in week 1. So they were using Valdez-Scantling there, and he's clearly down the depth chart. He's at best the wide receiver 5. So it's one of those awkward situations where I don't really want Shakir or Samuel because I feel like they're going to affect each other in a negative way. They're not going to get opportunities. They're going to take opportunities off each other. Don't particularly want Mac Hollins either. I think it's Keon Coleman, and then I think it's Dalton Kincaid that you want as the 2 receivers in this Bills offense. For the Carolina Panthers, no massive shocks here. They have been forced to keep some extra running backs, of course, because Jonathan Brooks is injured and will be out for some time. With the wide receivers, I guess the biggest surprise is probably that Xavier Legette still remains behind Jonathan Mingo. I think we assumed that at some point Legette would move past him, and that just hasn't happened. I do think during the season at some point it does happen, and that means you can't really realistically draft either of those guys in redraft. I don't want a guy sitting on my bench whose upside is to be the Panthers wide receiver 3, and he's not even going to be that for part of the season. I think it's going to take him time to really move into a proper role, and I'm not willing to wait for that. Adam Thielen is the slot receiver and will play the majority of snaps. He seemed to be playing over Mingo in 12 personnel, and that's very positive for him. Tommy Tremble and Ian Thomas have been injured. We don't know what's going to happen with Ja'Tavion Sanders, whether he's going to be an every down tight end or whether he's going to be in some sort of committee or whether potentially he's behind both of these guys. I do think Thomas is probably primarily a blocking guy. Tremble is kind of battling Sanders for those receiving snaps. I don't know what that's going to look like, so I'm avoiding them all. Chicago Bears, they're looking very strong still, and they haven't really dropped enough players to really tell us a lot of information. The running back room is a total mess because Roschon Johnson hasn't played at all during the preseason and wasn't even training at times during the offseason. DeAndre Swift is the clear starter, but to what extent he's the starter, we don't know. I think that probably Khalil Herbert is his early down backup, and Roschon Johnson is more of the receiving back kind of guy. I think this is a pretty similar situation to Arizona, but I think in this situation, we probably see a little bit less of Swift and we see more cycling with Herbert and Johnson, just enough to be inconvenient. It is possible as well that instead of Roschon Johnson, it is Travis Homer that does the 3-down work. That's what happened during the preseason, but I do think that he's more of a special teams guy, and it is Johnson that's going to be the main man there. With the receivers, the question mark is really who's going to be the 3rd wide receiver that doesn't play in 11 personnel. I think they probably cycle it a little bit. DJ Moore's the clear starter. I do think Keenan Allen spends most of his time in the slot, and he's going to be effective, but I do think he'll come off enough to give him some rest that we do see some Rome Odunze, and that gives Odunze at least some moderate value. There's no one behind either of these guys. Webster, who's more of a special teams guy, who'd worked his way up to apparently the wide receiver 4 slot, is now out for the season. So is Dante Pettis. So it's really just Carter. We've seen be effective in the past, and Scott. Neither of these guys are threatening roles. They're not going to get forced out onto the field. So I do think that possibly you just ignore the backups. It's the main 3, and they're the guys you want. With the tight ends, I'm totally avoiding Cole Kmet. Gerald Everett's going to be involved enough that it's going to be very inconvenient. I think both of those guys are going to have a massive negative effect on each other. They're essentially going to steal snaps from the other person and steal a whole heap of touches and it's going to be one of those committee situations you want to avoid. Cincinnati Bengals, no massive surprises here, except in the wide receiver room. Andre Josefas is clearly the wide receiver 3 slot guy. Jermaine Burton is well down the depth chart. He's slowly working his way up, but he's clearly behind those top 4. The real question with Josefas is not so much is he playing in 12 personnel, because firstly, they don't use that a lot. And secondly, when they do, realistically, it's never going to be him. It's always going to be Chase and Higgins. But is he going to be the slot guy that goes into that Tyler Boyd role? Or are we going to see him out there sometimes? And then when someone like a Chase or a Higgins shifts to the slot, do we see Trenton Irwin come out and play on the outside as more of a blocking option and more of a natural outside receiver? I think that's possible enough that Josefas is a little bit lower than most of the wide receiver 3s for me, even though I do think he has that role as then wide receiver 3, or what they would call their wide receiver 3, locked up. I'm not particularly interested in Jermaine Burton. Even if he can somehow work his way into that wide receiver 3 role, I don't think there's going to be enough value there to go out and get him. Tight end room is a total mess. Mike Gesicki appears to be the number 1 guy, but Drew Sample's going to be out there as a blocker and as a fullback. Eric Hall is still just coming back from injury and still has to show what he can do. He's a rookie. They've still got Tanner Hudson there, of course, who was the receiving back at times last year. Look, that's going to be an ugly mess. Mike Gesicki in a really deep league with tight end premium potentially could be someone you're interested in, but I'm probably avoiding them all. As for the Bengals running back room, well, it's Zach Moss versus Chase Brown. I feel like Moss is probably the main guy, and we see Brown as more of a receiving back. This will look similar to the Washington situation with Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler. In that situation, you probably want Moss, just like you probably want Robinson. But Chase Brown, in this case, does have a little bit more upside, being a young back to come in and eventually take over that every down role. I think it's unlikely. I think Moss is probably the guy you want, especially in half PPR and PPR, probably just avoiding them both. Cleveland Browns have kept 4 quarterbacks. Absolutely insane. There's something going on with Deshaun Watson around injuries. I don't know exactly what's happening here. Should you go out and get Jameis Winston? Probably not. I think this is just a whole ugly situation. So who does it affect? Not Amari Cooper, because he received from 5 quarterbacks last season, including Watson and Thompson Robinson, and also PJ Walker, and also Joe Flacco, and also Jeff Driscoll as well. So realistically, Amari Cooper's still pretty locked in. I really like him. I think he's underrated. The real question mark there for their wide receivers, is it Elijah Moore or Cedric Tillman for the wide receiver 3 spot? I thought it was Tillman. It looked like it was heading in that direction, but Moore and Tillman both played together in week 3 of the preseason, and Moore came out earlier. That's according to PFF, where I got a lot of the snap data from, by the way. So that does suggest Moore might be ahead. Either way, Jerry Jeudy is locked into the slot role. Moore isn't a natural outside receiver. I'm probably just avoiding the wide receiver 3 and focusing on Cooper and Jeudy. For the running back room, Nick Chubb will start on the PUP list as expected, which means Jerome Ford starts as a starting running back. Pierre Strong's the only backup on the roster, even though he's got a minor injury. They got rid of Donta Foreman, which is a bit of a surprise, and Naheem Hines is still injured and on IR, but designated to return as well. So not really sure what they're doing here. It is possible they have some guys on the practice squad and they'll just bring him in for individual games just as backups. I think that's probably the most likely outcome. Do you want Pierre Strong? Well, I think the upside's limited because Nick Chubb probably comes back at some stage. In the tight end room, nothing interesting. It's David Njoku. He's the guy you want. Dallas Cowboys. Trey Lance still on the roster despite throwing 5 interceptions in the 3rd preseason game. That's pretty nuts. They did release 2 of their running backs, and it's not Juice Vaughn, which I think makes sense because he is a better special teams player. I don't think Malik Davis showed quite enough to be a pure running back that doesn't quite have the same special teams ability. Royce Freeman does nothing on special teams. There was talk that he might take over the running back 2 role, but that's clearly Rico Dowdle. And as we saw when it was Tony Pollard and Zeke Elliott, when Zeke was a whole lot younger, that second running back, the speed guy, is actually very valuable. So I do think Rico Dowdle has some upside, and for that reason, I'm taking him late in a lot of drafts. Wide receiver-wise, we don't really know what's going on behind the main guys, but CeeDee Lamb's now signed a big contract, so he's very safe. He's my wide receiver 1. Brandon Cooks has limited upside. Jalen Tolbert's the wide receiver 3. There's no one to really threaten him. They will use Kevontae Turpin as kind of like that scat guy, and I do think that limits the value of those backup wide receivers a little bit because they are going to come off the field occasionally. You don't want any of the backups, though. With the tight ends, a little bit surprised that Peyton Hendershot was released. He was essentially their tight end 2 last season, but they seem to like what they like from Schoonmaker, and it makes sense that they'd keep him there behind Ferguson when they did spend at least some draft capital on him. Denver Broncos, this is going to be a total mess in Denver, but I do kind of like what they've done with their cutdown day. It makes sense that they would want to have their younger players involved, and they have ultimately gone for youth over experience. And I think when you know that your team's not going to be great, and I think maybe they do realize that, it does make sense to really focus on the young guys. So Bo Nix gets the start at quarterback, and I think unless he's terrible, he's probably going to keep that job because what's the point in handing it over to Jarrett Stidham? Bo Nix is hopefully your franchise quarterback. Jaleel McLaughlin must be not only the change of pace back, but also the third down back because they released Shamaje Perine. They also released Tyler Beatty. We haven't seen Audric Estime at all involved in the receiving game. He's essentially a backup to Javonte Williams at the moment. And they've kept Blake Watson, which I have to assume is more of a special teams situation there. So Javonte Williams is the main back, but I think this is going to be quite a bit of a committee. I think McLaughlin will get a lot of touches as a change of pace back. He's going to do the third down work, and I do think Estime gets involved at some point in time. So I'm generally avoiding this situation. I think probably Javonte Williams is the only guy that you particularly want, and that's really only in a zero RB situation. With the wide receivers, the big shock, Tim Patrick was the clear starter, and now he's got cut. I don't really know why they did that. That seems really weird. But ultimately, he's going to head over to the Detroit Lions. We'll talk about that in a second. Who takes over that role? Probably Marvin Mims. I mean, I do think that Josh Reynolds maybe now becomes the every down wide receiver too, and that Mims is kind of like the 11 personnel guy. It's possible they cycle Mims and Troy Franklin. Franklin's been well down. He's only been behind Tim Patrick, as everyone else. He's also been behind little Jordan Humphrey as well. So it's a little bit weird that all of a sudden they've released those two guys. He was also behind Devon Vele, who was a 7th round guy, where of course Franklin was taken very early on day 3 and realistically could have been a 2nd or 3rd rounder. So Vele's injured and it's hard to know where they would have sat with relation to each other. Otherwise, it's a very weird situation. I don't really understand what they're doing here, but I don't feel confident about getting any of these guys because I think this offense is going to be awful. Look at where Cortland Sutton is being drafted and then think, if you're not getting the wide receiver 1, how much upside does that player really have? For the tight ends, it's going to be a total mess. Greg Dolchich is going to lose snaps to Lucas Krull, and he's only the receiving tight end because Adam Troutman's going to be out there on a lot of early downs as the blocking tight end. I don't like this situation at all. I'm avoiding most Broncos players. Detroit Lions, they made some interesting decisions. They played Nate Sudfeld ahead of Hendon Hooker for most of the preseason and then released him. I assume we'll probably head to the practice squad, but it's still a little bit weird. For the running backs, interesting to see Sione Vaki in there. Wouldn't surprise me if he takes over from Craig Reynolds. He hasn't yet. Reynolds is the clear running back 3, but Vaki showed enough, and we know he's very good on special teams. He's also a safety, so it is entirely possible that they're thinking of him as more of a special teams player, but there's a little bit of upside there. You don't need Reynolds or Vaki in fantasy, though. For the wide receivers, they only have 4 wide receivers on their roster. They got rid of all of their main backups, including Peoples-Jones. Tim Patrick comes in, and Tim Patrick realistically is going into the practice squad, but he's surely got to be on the main roster by week 1. Really weird situation. As for tight ends, they also released James Mitchell, who they've used a relatively high amount, and Shane Zylstra as well. Presumably they go to the practice squad too. So it is going to be Laporta with Wright backing him up. Khalif Raymond plays in 11 personnel, but he does lack fantasy value because of how they use that position. The Green Bay Packers have been making some moves. Jordan Love's the clear starter, but they didn't like either of their backups, so they've shafted them and they've brought in Malik Willis from Tennessee and instead. That's a weird move, given Willis hasn't exactly looked fantastic, but then again, neither is Sean Clifford, so it kind of makes sense, I guess. In the running back room, well, the biggest surprise there, A.J. Dillon is out for the season, and suddenly Marshall Lloyd has a whole lot more value. Now, don't discount Emmanuel Wilson entirely. He is a good receiving back, and I do think that if Josh Jacobs goes down, Lloyd doesn't suddenly become a running back 1. He still loses a few touches to Wilson. It wouldn't surprise me if Wilson even gets a little bit involved while Jacobs is healthy. But it is probably now Marshall Lloyd moving up the handcuff list a little bit. For the wide receivers, it's Romeo Dobbs playing every down, then Christian Watson, and then Jaden Reed. Jaden Reed's still getting way fewer snaps than everyone else. And yet, at the end of last season, playing like 60 or 70% snaps. He was the wide receiver 7 down the stretch. absolutely crazy that he was able to be that efficient. Can he do it again this season? Well, with Christian Watson back, it's going to be a little bit tougher. I do think this whole situation's a bit messy with Dontavian Wicks hanging out there, and they do like to cycle in the other guys as well. So because of how much they cycle their wide receivers, I can't go up and reach for these guys, but I do think both Reed and Watson have some value where you can get them. Romeo Dobbs, we kind of know that he's going to be that guy that we see from quite a few teams. He's going to be like that wide receiver that's out there all the time, but realistically he's getting less targets than everyone else. Let someone else go and get him in drafts and spend that capital on him. For the tight ends, I think Luke Musgrave is probably the starter. We haven't actually seen it. Tucker Kraft was involved down the stretch even when Musgrave was healthy, but it's hard to tell if now that Musgrave's fully healthy again, he takes over that starting role. I hope he does. I've got him in a lot of dynasty teams. For the Houston Texans, a lot of people saying the Texans will be very good this season. I think they probably will. A couple of interesting points with them. Damian Pierce is technically the running back too, but hasn't looked fantastic, and presumably he's not playing on passing downs because he's terrible there. Dario Gunbowale would probably take that job, but it is possible that Cam Akers is finally healthy and therefore pushes both of them out and takes that running back 2 spot. He's at least moved past guys like Jawad Jordan, who was released as a rookie, and also JJ Taylor, I think, was over there, the former Patriot. So it is entirely possible that Cam Akers can work his way into an actual role, but this is Joe Mixon's backfield, and I'm not really going out of my way to get any of the backups. Tank Dell is unfortunately the wide receiver 3, so he's not going to play in 12 personnel. That's going to hurt him for fantasy. Now, we did see Jaden Reed still be effective despite not playing in 12 personnel, but he didn't have Stephon Diggs and he didn't have Nico Collins ahead of him. And for that reason, I'm avoiding Tank Dell in most of my leagues. The biggest surprise for me in the backups was that Noah Brown was released. He was, to me, the clear wide receiver 4, and now I don't know what's going on. Is it going to be Robert Woods? I mean, is he just there as a veteran presence? He's not going to play special teams, so presumably he's there as the next wide receiver. John Mechie's a talented player. I was hoping for more from him. Xavier Hutchinson, they still kind of like, but he's more of a special teams guy. It's a real mess, so I wouldn't be getting any of those guys as backups in any leagues. It'd be very interesting to see what happens if one of those top 3 goes down, who takes over. I think it's probably Woods or some sort of a committee. With the tight ends, the biggest surprise for me was Tegan Kitoriano getting released. I thought he was pretty good as a blocking tight end. So obviously they brought in Kate Stover to replace him as more of a blocking guy. Still, it's Dalton Schultz as the receiving guy. Brevin Jordan will be a little bit involved, and Stover, I mean, maybe one day he becomes more of a receiving tight end, but we do see with this mid to late round guys, it does usually take them a season or so before they're good enough to actually start playing any sort of every down receiving role. And I don't even know if that's in Stover's future with Dalton Schultz having gotten that big contract. Indianapolis Colts, no real surprises here. They did release a lot of running backs. Trey Sermon is injured, but I think the fact that they released both Evan Hull and Xavier Scott is a good sign that Sermon's going to be okay. He's a very valuable backup to me. I'm not particularly worried about Tyler Goodson. I feel like he's the clear number 3. We did see last season when both Taylor and Moss went down, Sermon was the main of one of the 2 backs, but they did still use a little bit of Goodson. That does limit Sermon's upside a little bit, but we do know that Jonathan and Taylor can be injured. We do know this is a good running game. Their O-line is spectacular. So for that reason, I still think Sermon has a little bit of upside. Wide receivers is interesting because Josh Downs is out at least for the first couple of weeks, though he's not on IR. That does mean that we'll see some Adonai Mitchell. What happens when Josh Downs comes back? Does Mitchell stay in the slot? Well, no way, because Downs is going to play there. Can he push Pierce out from that wide role? They do like Pierce in that wide role. Doesn't catch a lot of balls, but he does a lot of things well, and he's a good blocking option, and they need that with this run game. So I'm a little bit nervous about AD Mitchell. I'm not really willing to go out of my way to get him. Tight end room's real ugly. It's going to remain a committee. I don't want any of these guys. And Jelani Woods is out for the season. He was the only one that might have been interesting and able to take over a lead role. And he was like the tight end 4 during the preseason. So this is going to remain a committee. Just ignore the Colts tight ends. For the Jaguars, Mac Jones won the backup role, but gosh, it was ugly. I don't particularly think that if Trevor Lawrence goes down, things are going to look good. In Jacksonville, it wouldn't surprise me if we do see CJ Beathard pop up if we see a Lawrence injury. So that makes me a little bit nervous about their wide receivers because ideally you want them to be able to play effectively with anybody. I don't know that that's the case. Gabe Davis, for me, is likely to be out there pretty much every snap, and he's going to have very little value. He's going to be worse than he was in Buffalo because you don't have Josh Allen's massive arm. I do think Brian Thomas Jr. is going to play a lot, and he's going to be effective, but Christian Kirk's still the main guy here for me. For the running backs, Etienne's usage got mixed up a little bit. But realistically, he is still the every down back, and they're going to cycle into Tank Bigsby and maybe a little bit Dearness Johnston. Bigsby's gone well past Johnson now, and suddenly he's one of the best backups in the league for me. Evan Ingram was losing a lot of snaps to Luke Farrell. I don't know if that's just because it was the preseason, but it's a little bit concerning and has moved Ingram down a little bit for me. Kansas City Chiefs. Look, love my Chiefs, but doing some weird stuff. Generic Prince was playing ahead of Clyde Edwards-Helaire at times in the preseason at training camp, and he got released. So did Louis Rees-Zammit, who looked like a talented prospect. They kept Carson Steele, an undrafted guy who was listed as a fullback originally and is now their running back 3. It's just a really strange situation. I don't understand what's happening. And that's strange in particular because they only kept 3 running backs, but Edwards-Helaire is out because he's struggling with PTSD situations from something that happened a good 6 or 7 years ago. Hopefully he's okay, firstly. But secondly, that does mean they might need to rely on Steele a little bit if anything happens to Pacheco. So very strange situation. Presumably they have some plans to stash at least some of those guys on the practice squad. Wide receiver room, we've talked about this heaps. Marquise Brown is injured. It's going to be Rice. It's going to be Worthy. Brown will come in and be that number 3 guy, but it's going to be Justin Watson who's still then. Kadarius Toney being released is a bit of a surprise to me. Be interesting to see if he ever actually turns into anything. He's got to stop getting injured first. Don't get involved in the backup tight ends here. Jared Wiley has no value. Noah Gray is still the backup, and he doesn't even have much value because it's all Travis Kelce, and if Kelce goes down, it will be a committee. They also signed Peyton Hendershot, which is interesting because they don't really have a natural blocking tight end. They're all receiving guys, and Hendershot's very much a receiving tight end. For the Raiders, they have chosen Gardner Minshew to be their quarterback, at least initially. Interesting to see if that sticks. Probably good news for the wide receivers. Devontae Adams, probably now a top 10 guy for me, especially in PPR. Jacoby Myers does have some sneaky value. He has moved back to the slot, and that's very useful for him. They did give Wilkerson a chance to the slot and move Myers outside. Wilkerson's been released. Fantastic news for Myers. Trey Tucker's been moved outside, which is weird because he has been a slot guy in the past, but it does seem like he's going to be the clear wide receiver 3. I think he has limited value because we probably see a lot of 2 tight end sets, with Brock Bowers being the clear receiving guy, and that's been obvious from the preseason, and Michael Mayer being mainly the blocking guy who is also doing a little bit of receiving work. They've also kept Harrison Bryant. We know he can block as well. For the running back game, Dylan Lowry has played every down of the final preseason game, at least while he was on the field in his patch. He wasn't just the receiving back, which we thought he might be, but he's still at best the running back 3. I do think that probably Alexander Madison is probably taking the receiving work initially. I think probably technically Amir Abdul is currently the running back 3, but Lowry goes past him. Abdullah can do enough on special teams, and so can Lowry, that they can keep both. I think that Zamir White's the guy you want, but he's got limited upside because we're going to see a lot more Alexander Madison than we want. And I do think even if Madison goes down, we start to see a lot more Lowry than we want. With the Chargers, no real shocks here. The fact that they were playing Spiller ahead of Isaiah Spiller, that is the running back, ahead of Jarrett Patterson, who had previously been playing ahead of Kamani Vidal, but then Vidal sat out the last game. It's all a big mess. I think the Vidal's probably the running back 3, but you don't want any of those lower down guys. I think it's probably Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, but this could be a real mess. We don't know how they're going to use these guys. I think it's probably going to look a lot like it did in Baltimore. And if you think back to Baltimore, were you going out of your way to get Gus Edwards onto your team when it was in Baltimore? Not really. Maybe in a non-PPR league, but it's just an awkward situation that I don't like very much. For the wide receivers, it was very weird in week 2 where Brendan Rice suddenly starts playing and starting in the preseason ahead of both Quentin Johnston and DJ Shark. And then they sat Johnston and Shark in week 3. I don't really understand what they're doing there, but I do know that I don't want any of those 3 wide receivers. It's Josh Palmer as the number 1 guy, and for me, Ladd McConkey is the number 1 guy for fantasy. Whether he plays in 11 personnel is going to make a big difference to his value, but I do think that slot role for Justin Herbert in this offense is going to be very valuable. Chargers seem to be using their backups by position, which makes it really awkward for guys like Johnston and Shark. So I'm not really sure what to make of that. That is a thing some teams do, is they're kind of embedding their structures, and players don't have time to learn all of the different positions. Hurston Disley will be in a committee at tight end. They did release Donald Parham, which is weird because he's been used quite a lot at times. I thought maybe he would step into the starting role. Instead, he's gone altogether. Stone Smart is their number 3 guy. You don't want any of their tight ends. With the Rams, we know what the Rams are going to do because they always sit all of their best players. during the preseason. So Matthew Stapp is their starter. Jimmy Garoppolo is suspended for a little while. Stetson Bennett played a lot in the preseason, and he didn't look great. For the running backs, it should be Kyron Williams because it announces this punt returner today, which is really strange. I'm not sure what they're doing there, but I do still think he's an every down back. I think you're probably going to find you get him cheaper in drafts now because people might be scared off by that. Still taking. Blake Corum is the best backup in the league. I would definitely want to get my hands on him, especially if I have Williams. The only issue, of course, is if it ends up being a committee. But if either of them goes down, the other one is going to be enormously valuable because I don't think they particularly like Ronnie Rivers. I weren't even willing to put him out there last season where Williams was a bit knocked up. They were playing Williams on like nearly 100% of snaps. With the wide receivers, we know that Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are going to be the 1 and 2. It's just whether it's DeMarcus Robinson or Tutu Atwell. They both sat out all preseason, but I think Robinson's going to be the wide receiver 3. A lot of people talking about Jordan Whittington and saying I need to talk about him more. He's the wide receiver 5. What do you want me to say? Like, he needs 2 injuries ahead of him to be the wide receiver 3, and you guys don't want the wide receiver 3 on your fantasy teams, so why would you want Jordan Whittington? Just don't bother. With the tight ends, Tyler Higbee is going to miss a lot of the season, I suspect. So Colby Parkinson becomes kind of like fantasy viable in the same way that Higbee was, as someone that you might get on your bench. If you're playing in a league where you really need to go deep to get a tight end because there's limited options, he's someone you can get. He's probably going to end up being around the tight end 20 most weeks. Miami Dolphins, no real surprises here. They did release a lot of their wide receivers. They've only got 5 of them. And Odell Beckham Jr. will start the season on IR, so it's going to be back to Braxton Berrios again. The 7th rounder, Washington, is a bit of a surprise there, but I do like Malik Washington. I think he's going to be interesting as a guy that we might see a little bit of if he can play well in the opportunities he's given. Tight ends, I really hoped Jonnu Smith was going to be good, but Durham Smythe was getting too involved in the preseason, and I'm very scared this is going to turn into a committee situation, especially because they kept 4 tight ends. You know they want to run the ball a lot, and for that reason, you could expect a blocking tight end out there a lot, and that also limits the upside of their wide receiver 3. With the run game, obviously, Raheem Mostert is the top guy. I say obviously, but many people are still drafting Devon Achane just way ahead of him, and I don't understand why. What did you see last season about Mostert's production that made you think he's going to step back this season? He is obviously their number 1 guy. Even if he gets half the amount of touchdowns he did last season, pretty sure he had 18 touchdowns, he's still going to be like a top 15 running back, and you can get him as like the running back 20-something. It's absolutely crazy. He would need to just totally lose that role and have Achane be the clear number 1 guy for Mostert not to pay off. Meanwhile, Achane needs to take over from Mostert and push him out, which is very unlikely. And even if there's a Mostert injury, I think Jalen Wright's pretty much the same as Raheem Mostert, and they spent a 3rd-round pick for next year on Jalen Wright to trade up for him. Clearly, they like him. They see him as a Mostert replacement. I think that all this Achane love is really going to backfire on people. As for the quarterback, it's all to Skylar Thompson being the backup's a little bit weird because Mike White was seen as the better quarterback, but apparently we're going with the former 7th rounder. Minnesota Vikings have released a whole lot of running backs. Kene Nwangwu is a bit of a surprise to me when the return game is going to be so valuable. But ultimately, it's Aaron Jones and Ty Chandler. If Jones goes down, I think Ty Chandler suddenly becomes massively valuable. I guess the same thing happens if Ty Chandler goes down. I think it might be a little bit more of a committee than Jones owners prefer, but I do love Ty Chandler. He's one of my favorite backups. Him, Blake Corum are guys I really want to get on my roster. With JJ McCarthy out, Sam Darnold is very clearly the starting quarterback. And if you're worried about things for Justin Jefferson, I mean, Sam Darnold has functioned with good wide receivers before and made them very productive. And we know that Nick Mullins, who's the backup, is a very aggressive quarterback, and he'll be able to produce with Justin Jefferson as well. For that reason, Justin Jefferson is still my wide receiver 3. I think he's going to be fantastic. The news about McCarthy being injured actually pushed Jefferson up for me because I think McCarthy is a little bit too passive to make Jefferson good. Jordan Addison will probably rise a little bit for me, but we'll see what happens. For the tight ends, even though TJ Hawkinson's going to miss half the season, you don't want any of those backups. It is probably Johnny Munt, but he's probably not someone you would need on your roster unless you're in an extraordinarily deep league. I'm in a 32-team league, and he's not going to start for me, even though I've got him on my roster. For the Patriots, no real surprises here. Jacoby Brissett is still the starter, but Drake May will threaten and will start at some stage this season, I expect, because I think the Patriots are going to be awful. Antonio Gibson is one of the league's best handcuffs. how he's used is really going to be an interesting point. If he's used as a true backup rather than a committee back, then Ramondre Stevenson's going to be tremendously valuable, as he was a couple of seasons ago when he was a top 12 running back. If we see a lot of Gibson, then Stevenson could be a little bit of an overbuy, and a little bit concerned I might have him ranked a little bit high. Regardless, Gibson is one of the most valuable handcuffs because there's no one threatening behind them. If Stevenson goes down, Gibson becomes an every down back, and we see just a little bit of Hasty and Harris. With the wide receivers, it's real ugly. Kendrick Bourne should be the only guy that you really like as a starter, and he's injured. So he's not even starting week one. Demario Douglas isn't playing outside 11 personnel, so you can't really have him, even though a lot of people are drafting him late. KJ Osborne and Tyquan Thornton are technically the outside starting wide receivers, but we don't know who's going to play what snaps and what roles they're going to have. Jalen Polk's going to take over at some stage. Maybe we see Javon Baker at some point in time. This is going to be a total mess all season. I don't want any of those guys. The only guys you really want on this team are Ramondre Stevenson, Antonio Gibson, and Hunter Henry. For the Saints, they've kept 3 quarterbacks, which is very weird. Not really sure what they're doing there. I guess they drafted Spencer Rattler, even though it was only a 5th, and they want to keep him on the roster. For the running backs, Kendre Miller is starting the season on IR, but he is designated for return. Dennis Allen has been all over Miller all off-season. There's no way he's anywhere near Kamara or Williams. This is Kamara's backfield, and we do see a little bit of Williams as the backup. And Jordan Mims hasn't looked bad as well in relief. For the wide receivers, Olave is the only guy you really want. Shaheed's a bit injured. I don't think he's someone that I want particularly in my roster. He will have some boom weeks, and he's useful in best ball, but for the most part, he's not someone you want to draft. Cedric Wilson is the clear number 3 guy in a very deep league. He's of interest, but Bub Memes is a rookie that you might have picked up. He's worth holding on to because I do think he could take over a role at some point in time. A.T. Perry is very much droppable, as some people had him last season when he was starting. Among the tight ends, Juwan Johnson is back and he's clearly healthy. He played in week 3 of the preseason. He will play in week 1 of the regular season. But Taysom Hill remains a good fantasy option, especially in non-PPR and half PPR, because they are using him a lot. With the Giants, Devin Singletary, the clear starter, but Tyron Tracy could threaten him at some point in time. He's a solid backup option because he could take over the role on merit. Problem is he's injured now, and that does limit his value, but do you even want the starting Giants running back? In what situation are you actually going to go out of your way to get him, even if you knew that Tracy was the starter? I feel like even if you knew Tracy's the starter, you're probably still taking him in the 6th or 7th round. So it's not really worth stashing him on your bench unless you're in a dynasty league, or alternatively you're in a situation where you're really struggling at running back. For the wide receivers, Malik Neighbors is the only one with value. I think he could be very good in PPR. Wan'Dale Robinson is going to be the slot guy. We don't know whether he's going to be on the field with 12 personnel or not. Their third wide receiver slot will probably cycle a bit between Jalen Hyatt and Darius Slayton, so you don't want either of those guys either. And they released pretty much everyone below that, which was really weird. Tight ends will be committee. I think Theo Johnson might technically be the starter, but Daniel Bellinger's just going to be involved enough to be annoying, and we will see a lot of Manhurts doing some blocking work on running downs as well. With the Jets, no real surprises here compared to what we've seen in previous weeks. They kept basically all the players we'd expect them to keep. Where I'm really concerned is how Braylon Allen fits in, because both him and Isaiah Davis set out week 3. It seemed like Braylon Allen was going to be the clear backup to Breece Hall, and that was going to give him a lot of value as a very talented player who would go into an every down role. Then suddenly Isaiah Davis started ahead of him in week 2. We don't know if that was some sort of punishment, if that was just the experimenting with something, but it does seem like potentially they're seeing Davis ahead of Allen, or they see it as a competition or a committee. That's scary either way, and that's made me go off Braylon Allen a lot after I liked him a heap earlier in the preseason. Malaki Corley is the backup slot guy, but realistically, it's not hard to see him going past Xavier Gibson, who I've misspelled. There is a chance he wins that job, but how much value is it really going to have? Mike Williams hasn't returned from injury yet. I believe that he's at least doing a little bit of training, but Alan Lazard's probably going to be his backup. I can't see them using Corley there. Lazard is limited in value entirely. Tylen Conklin does have some sneaky fantasy value. He does often pop up as a top 15, top 20 tight end. I'm a little bit nervous about Jeremy Ruckert taking over his role at some point in time, but he's like a late tight end you can get if you're desperate, or if you're not sure about your starting tight end position, you need a backup that you can maybe rely on. For the Eagles, no real shocks here since they traded for Jahan Dotson. That was the only real surprise. As soon as they did that, made sense they'd release Paris Campbell. They've still got Johnny Wilson, their 6th-round guy. He's a little bit injured, but I do think he's probably the number 1 backup. Anais Smith has gone on IR for the season, which is a pity for the rookie. So the 5th wide receiver is currently Britton Covey, which is interesting because he's very much a special teams guy. I do think that it's probably just the top 2 guys, and then Dodson kind of cycles in when they're not using 2 tight end sets. I think that Goddard's probably the main other receiver that you want. And the running back room's interesting. I think Saquon Barkley's the clear number 1, but is it Gainwell or Shipley behind him? I think it's probably a committee if Barkley goes down. And I think we see more of Gainwell on receiving downs, but Shipley will get some opportunities as well on early downs. I don't think you want any of those guys, except Barkley, obviously. For the Steelers, Russell Wilson appears to have won the starting job, but Justin Fields will be hovering, and it wouldn't surprise me if he takes over at some stage. If that happens, Fields suddenly becomes very valuable because I could imagine they use him as a runner a lot. Jalen Warren has a hamstring injury, but he's expected to be fine by week 1. I'm always really nervous with hamstring injuries, so I've moved him down my rankings because of that. Roman Wilson was running with the ones in training camp, then got injured. Now we don't know where he is. We know where he is. He's with the Steelers, but we don't know where he is on the depth chart. Obviously, I think probably he's number 4, but he could take over from Van Jefferson. We know they've been trying very hard to get Brandon Ayuk. We still haven't heard any resolution on that. So where he sits is a big question mark. If Ayuk comes in, obviously he takes over from Jefferson, but if not, it is possible Roman Wilson gets healthy and he takes over from Jefferson. With the tight ends, I'm really worried about Pat Freiermuth. Arthur Smith is in Pittsburgh now. We know how he uses his tight ends. They've kept both Washington and Pruitt, as well as Hayward, who's the backup for Freiermuth. I feel like we're going to end up with a really ugly committee, and you won't want any Pittsburgh tight ends at all. For the 49ers, interesting that Brandon Allen appears to have won the backup job over Josh Jobs. They've kept both of them. Don't know why they did that. The biggest news for the running backs is that Elijah Mitchell is shockingly out for the season. I didn't see that coming. Jordan Mason is the backup, but Isaac Guerrero is still hanging around. I think if McCaffrey goes down or isn't healthy for week 1, we probably do see Mason as the starter, but Guerrero gets involved enough to be inconvenient. Brandon Ayuk's holdout continues. I've got nothing more to I've got nothing more to say on that at the moment. I've talked about that in so many videos. You get the idea. Ricky Pearsall's still injured a little bit, but I feel like he's probably the wide receiver 3, but we see enough of Jawan Jennings, especially as a blocker, to be inconvenient. The tight end chart is weird. They got rid of a whole heap of players. They got rid of Eric Sobert and Braden Willis, who were the tight end 2 and tight end 3 for most of the preseason. They got rid of Cameron Latu, who was a player I really liked, and they only drafted a couple of years ago. In fact, last year he was a rookie and he didn't play at all because he was injured. You just have to assume he hasn't gotten healthy. Hopefully he goes to the practice squad, gets it together, and is able to come back in eventually. But it's Jake Tonges who's the backup now for Kittle. I don't really know what that means or where the value there lies. I don't know why I wrote it at the end of that sentence. With Seattle, nothing interesting to talk about here, realistically. They did everything we'd expect them to do. We don't really know how they're going to use Charbonnet compared to Kenneth Walker. Is he still going to be out there on a lot of passing downs? He played over 50% snaps at times last season, but was rarely getting touches because they'd always run the ball when Walker was out there and always pass it when Charbonnet was out there. I don't know whether they're going to do that again. Tyler Lockett didn't play in week 3 of the preseason, but Jackson Smith-Njigba did. We don't know, therefore, whether Lockett or JSN will play in 12 personnel. Jake Bobo is a really high-value backup. If one of those guys is out, we do know that they will use Bobo and he will get involved. So I like him in best ball in particular. Noah Fant and Pharaoh Brown are both injured, but I think Fant's probably a good starter in week 1. And I think he could be sneaky value at tight end. Tampa. Biggest news here is that Chase Edmonds is out for the season, meaning Bucky Irving is the clear backup, and that has a lot of value because we've seen how they use Rashad White. I don't think they use Irving a lot, and potentially this actually really helps White, but Irving is someone that we could see get used a heap if we see Rashad White goes down, and therefore he's someone that I would want to get on my bench. Trey Palmer and Jalen McMillan continue to battle for that wide receiver 3 role. We don't know who's ahead. It's probably McMillan, but I do think Palmer's gotten a chance or it's some sort of committee. Chris Godwin's moved to the slot, and he's been very effective there, and that increases his value. Bit surprising that Devin Culp's made the roster as a 7th rounder. We also saw the same thing with Jaheim Bell, who's a 7th round tight end for New England. It's really hard to be a 7th round tight end and make the roster, so you must be doing a good job on special teams, I suspect. For the Titans, obviously, they've traded away Malik Willis because they're only keeping 2. And Mason Rudolph's done enough of a job, but clearly it's Will Levis who's the starter. Tony Pollard is the nominal starter at running back, but I do think we see a lot of Tajay Spears, and this is a true committee. Bit surprised that they've released Jamari Small. He looked pretty good, but I suspect he goes to the practice squad and could well take over from Julius Chestnut at some point in time. DeAndre Hopkins is the starter, is expected to be back for week 1, but how much value is he really going to have as a post-30 wide receiver in this pretty crowded wide receiver room with Will Levis throwing the ball for a Titans team that wants to run a heap? Chig Okonkwo keeps losing snaps to everybody, Wiley, Vanette, literally Odu Koya, who's their overseas pathway player. I think he's out of Nigeria. Look, everyone's taking snaps away from Okonkwo, which is disappointing. He's just not going to turn into the guy we hoped he'd be. Washington Commanders, finally. Jane Daniels, the clear starter, but they kept Jeff Driscoll, which is really interesting. I think there are some concerns over Mariota a little bit. Biggest surprise there is that they released Chris Rodriguez. He was their number 3 last season. He looked pretty good, but Jeremy McNichols takes over that role. Clearly, Brian Robinson and Oster Eckler are the main guys. Talked about this earlier. Robinson is the is the early down guy. Austin Eckler is the receiving down guy. But it's not going to quite be that clear. I do think they'll both do a little bit of both, but it's probably going to, for the most part, turn out that way. Wide receiver room's a total mess. Obviously, they traded away Jahan Dotson, which makes no sense to me. De'Ami Brown will play on the outside. I don't know who's in the slot. I think it's probably Olamide Zaccheaus. I'd personally prefer that it's Jamison Crowder. I think he'd be better for the team now. And long-term, you'd rather it was Luke McCaffrey, who was clearly a reach when they took him late on day 2. For the tight end, Zach Ertz will start. John Bates is still ahead of Ben Sinnott, but some stage Sinnott's going to take over there. And that's it. That's 32 teams in way less time than I thought it would take, which is fantastic because I got more work to do tonight. If you haven't already, this is the work I'll be doing tonight. A lot of people hitting me up for personalized rankings with the big weekend of drafts coming up. So get involved. I've still got space, can definitely make some for you. Email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. The deal's simple. I will make rankings specifically for your league. They'll have your exact league settings, your exact roster construction. They'll be perfect for your league, going to give you a massive advantage over everyone else in your league. So make sure you hit me up on email or over Twitter or Instagram DMs. Happy to help you out there. And as always, if you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. That really helps us out. Also, check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all of your messages over there. On Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and I will be updating them in the next day or so. And of course, you can find my articles at football.rasball.com. I will be back in the next couple of days with more fantasy football content as I release my final rankings for this season, and we start talking about week 1. Looking forward to getting into some football in the next week or so. I will see you soon.